Thank you, friends, for being with us today. To our panelists, I'd love for us to do just like a really quick round robin to warm up our voices a little bit here, and just introduce yourself and the institution or organization that you're with. And Dr. Benzies, we'll start with you.
All right. Thank you, Serenity, and thanks for having me. I am Karen Benzies, trained clinically as a registered nurse and midwife. I'm a full professor in the Faculty of Nursing and Director of Social Innovation through the Vice President Research Office, all at the University of Calgary.
Perfect. Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Serenity, and thanks for everyone for being here. I'm Ian McClure, an Associate Vice President for Research, Innovation, and Economic Impact at the University of Kentucky, and I oversee what we call UK Innovate, our innovation and entrepreneurship enterprise, which is inclusive of our social innovation team led by our esteemed moderator here, Dr. Serenity Wright.
Thank you. Dr. Wilkinson.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. So I'm the CEO of an organization called Praxis Oral, soon to be Knowledge Exchange UK, as in Knowledge Exchange United Kingdom. So we're a professional body that supports people in universities that are trying to have an impact from research. I've been in this post for about 6 months, but before that I was Assistant Director of Innovation Engagement at the University of Oxford, which might sort of figure in what we talk about later.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Today is really about setting the stage. How do we use and leverage social innovation from definition to commercialization? How do we talk about it? How do we use it to effectuate the impact of our research? And then we'll have some future webinars coming up later on this year that really delve down into the specifics of different best practices. So, Karen, I'm going to come to you first because I want us to talk about the context of social innovation. And specifically for you, I would like for you to talk about this from a research lens. I do think it's very important for us to note and to be thinking about the research behind why we choose to do social innovation and why it's so important. So, Karen, context of research in social innovation.
Okay, so I guess I'll put a caveat on that. I am not the expert. I look to my colleagues in Europe for a lot of that expertise. So, but from my perspective, as a professor at the university, education and research are hallmarks of post-secondary educational institutions. But increasingly, universities are being called on for a third mission, and that's to give back to society by undertaking innovative initiatives to address complex societal challenges. 4 years ago, when I started work on the Social Innovation Task Force at the University of Calgary, elected officials from government, executive directors of foundations asked me, what is social innovation really? What is our money being used for? How can we be sure that our money is being put to good use? And I didn't have good answers for them at the time. And as an academic, I believe that if you cannot define something, you can't measure it. And if you cannot measure it, you can't know if you got any better. So without a definition, it would be difficult to demonstrate accountability for investments in social innovation projects and initiatives that came out of post-secondary educational institutions. So we used a special research method called concept analysis to create a definition of social innovation for post-secondary educational institutions. And we screened 1,800 titles and abstracts and synthesized definitions from 272 articles to derive the definition that you see on the screen. So for post-secondary educational institutions, we say that social innovation is the intentional implementation of a transdisciplinary initiative to address a social challenge through collaborative action leading to new or improved capabilities and relationships to generate evidence-informed solutions that are more effective, efficient, just, and sustainable. And what we added to the existing literature with this definition was the idea of intentionality. Projects have a start and an end date at universities, so we needed to add that piece. Transdisciplinarity was important because knowledge and solutions are missing are often lying at the boundaries of disciplines, and evidence informed because universities' mission is to generate evidence. So this research was published in Humanities and Social Science Communications. So with a definition, post-secondary educational institutions can create strategic plans, allocate resources to build capacity for social innovation, and to address their third mission. Now we have a definition. We're beginning the research to understand the best ways to measure social innovation, to increase the accountability for outcomes and impacts. And I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Stuart, I'm going to come to you next because I think one of the things that has been so, I guess, critical for me as a practitioner, right, of social innovation and a researcher is thinking about this frame that Karen just placed for us about the importance of research and having a definition and using that to really guide best practice forward, to guide knowledge exchange forward, right? Like, I'm not going to hide it from the audience attending Praxis Oral last summer and hearing you all talk about the growth and enhancements of innovations from a knowledge exchange perspective and a theory of change perspective, as opposed to just moving technology or transferring technology or just commercializing, right? Like, it was just such a mindset shift for me that was so incredibly critical. So will you talk a little bit about that, about theory of change, about how social innovation fits inside of that, and the shift in the UK from this transactional approach that I was operating from to a true transferring of knowledge approach?
Yeah, sure. And I think the language knowledge exchange is not unique to the UK, but we thought long and hard about it. So the journey from the beginnings, which was very similar to Karen's sort of comments, government asking the question of what is the return on investment of our funding into universities? What is the benefit of this? If we're sat here making decisions about where we put budgets to education or health or research, help us to understand the benefits. Now, back in the 80s, we followed a very similar path to the US and started thinking about how IP generated from research could be transferred into the world outside of academia. And so we very much at that time used the word technology transfer, which I think will be very common and familiar to this sort of audience. But as that progressed, it became apparent in the UK system, in the United Kingdom system, that actually all research has a role to play, and that rather than it just being technology that we transfer out, we have this bit of IP, we'll transfer it out. The language broadened to be knowledge transfer, and that language is very common in Europe to think about what knowledge is being generated through research that incorporates beyond the sciences and beyond technology. So we started to embrace the language of knowledge transfer. And then the next iteration that came about 10 years ago was realizing that this exchange between two parties wasn't just a transfer. It wasn't just those in their dreaming spires or their ivory towers going, we have some great ideas there, go and get on with it, but actually benefited from an exchange. That if that idea was to have more of an impact, it needed to be informed by the environment and the context with which it was going into. So a really good example of that was our biomedical engineers going and working closely with the clinicians so they could identify how best to deploy that idea into a clinical setting. And so this idea of exchange, that working with the beneficiaries of that research before, during, and after that research really helps to sharpen the impact that you can have. And this has been sort of mirrored in how the funding systems in the UK and the United Kingdom have sort of evolved, where there is an increasing desire for you to think about the potential impact of that research at the beginning, and to devote some time and effort into ensuring that impact happens. So it's not just transactional anymore. It's very broad, but it's also thinking about how you can support and take that idea further towards the beneficiaries that might use it and benefit from it and make it a stronger, more successful proposition.
Yeah, I hear, Karen, all throughout your answer there, right? In the sense that the language has to evolve, and that's part of the research in and of itself. And I think sometimes we forget that part, right? That in order to be better, we've also got to analyze the language that we're using for how we're supposed to evolve to get there. And actually use this to come to you, because I think one of the things that has allowed us to be so successful at the University of Kentucky is because we've capitalized on an pivotal moment in time where there was a language shift. There was an evolution in some language that has given us a runway to really push social innovation forward and to drive that forward. And specifically from the federal funding agencies, right? And they're, I refer to them as the Elite Eight, right? And their call for societal impact, and that we have to be able to demonstrate that in our research, not just the societal impact part, but the sustainability of that. So today, I'm not asking you really to talk about social innovation from your position at UK, because I want to do that. So I'm going to kick you out of that sandbox for just a minute. But I would like for you to talk about it from maybe a broader perspective around federal funding, but also, did you use that, and how do we use that at UK to even get us here today?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the title of this webinar is Growing Through Social Innovation. And a good way to respond to your question, Serenity, is sort of to tell the story of how we have grown at UK, at the University of Kentucky, and UK Innovate, our innovation entrepreneurship enterprise here, through social innovation, but with purposeful and careful language shift. And so, as you know well, Serenity, when I was able to first convince my institutional leadership here that we needed to invest in social innovation, I also realized quickly that I needed to use language more appropriate to what that meant. Because we have this, and this is not unique to our university, this is in the United States, we like to call it technology transfer, which in and of itself is terminology that isn't so applicable perhaps to the types of societal impact and social innovation work that we can do. So because we've called it that, and for many other reasons, we have largely focused on STEM and the tools and resources and processes that might acclimate to STEM. And so when I asked my institution to invest in a social innovation team, the response first was, well, don't we already do that? We do copyright licensing, right? Those things. And I said, no, I think I'm going to have to change the narrative here. So the narrative I first used with them was, no, this is really about diversifying our innovator base that we engage with for tech transfer. We talk a lot about culture shift, right? If we want to truly measure culture shift or just culture growth, right? Let's measure the new the new innovators that engage with us on a year-over-year basis. And an investment in social innovation was the best way we could do that immediately, right? And monitor that. And as you know, Serenity, I think you're going to talk about how we have both tracked that with a lot of success, and we've been able to demonstrate that success. So that's how I was able to first message the need, the upside here to my institution with a language and messaging shift. But on the national scale, and this is important to your question, I'm a part of the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, advising our Department of Commerce and our Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, with a group of really smart people from all over our country to develop really a sort of a national entrepreneurship policy. In fact, we published it a few months ago called Competitiveness Through Entrepreneurship, a Strategy for U.S. Innovation. If you haven't read it, go take a look. Through the year of discussions with venture capitalists, really successful entrepreneurs, economic developers, and other highly influential people in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, often we came to discussions around social innovation being a tenet of new investment that needs to happen. And then, of course, because we were developing an advisory document for our federal government, we then next looked to, is this being funded anywhere? Is our federal government are they acknowledging the need to invest in dedicated resources for social innovation, not making the misstep that my and other institutions had been for years, that, hey, tech transfer is already inclusive of that work. And so you will find in that NACI document calls for investments in societal impact work through tech transfer, community engaged work for tech transfer, and social innovation in particular. And now we have seen that in some of the programs that have come out and been launched. First, from the CHIPS and Science Act that was authorized in 2022, and I can speak to more of those maybe later in this conversation. But I can say that there's a bit of an awakening happening right now in the United States, that this is needed. It's mission critical, but also we need new investments in dedicated efforts to do it. And that's what we have done at the University of Kentucky by first realizing that we weren't already doing it.
Yeah, and that, I think your statement, I'm sure you could see me scribbling while you were talking, was well, don't we already do that, right? And it's not that we weren't, right? I often talk about it as like social innovation from a research perspective, the idea of doing community engaged research to co-create and co-design a product, intervention, training, tool, whatever it is, that piece isn't new. That probably precedes some of the more predominant bench research that we see now, right? But what is new is intentional research around why this matters, right? And the benefits, the impact, the outcome, the metrics of why these pieces are important. So I think it's really critical for us to address it's more than just, didn't we already do that? And really talk about research as it is now, and the impact, the outcomes, the metrics from that research, and why that's so important to inform practice, because it is more than just, didn't we already do that? So Karen, as my person on the panel to push and represent the research, do you mind to share your thoughts on this piece? And I know we shared a moment up in Calgary when I was there for your conference around the metrics, but you maybe end with the metrics, but come back a little bit to the research to inform the practice and why that's so important.
Okay. I'd first like to respond to Ian, his point, and somehow Donald Trump is front and center here on my screen, so I can't see you all at this particular moment, and I'm trying to just say, Mr. Trump, you need to go away. Because the whole piece around the measurement is so important. And Yorgi Kurlev, in his book on social economy, which is a great read if you get a chance, he cites data from the province of Quebec, and they are working really hard to be able to truly understand social innovation and social entrepreneurship. And they've got data because they've built systems to collect it. In my province, we are using as proxy for entrepreneurship, social innovation change, not-for-profits as a sort of a metric, a proxy metric. Is just not suitable. It doesn't really work. So we need to follow along the ideas of leaders in terms of how to measure these things. Because if you are in Quebec, you would know that there are 12 100 social enterprises employing 240,000 people with a contribution of about $48 billion to the GDP in that province. But we don't have that anywhere else in the country. So your point is really critically important. Now on to answer the question that Serenity posed. So my background's in health, and Serenity's popped up a framework called the Learning Health System. And what we see here is the idea of outcomes, and they're generic. So patient outcomes, staff experiences, population health, and value for money. And that value doesn't necessarily equate to dollars and cents. But to generate those outcomes, Munir describes this iterative process that moves from practice to data, from data to knowledge, and then from knowledge to practice. And it's an iterative circle. And this process occurs in different ecosystems of change, including different levels and systems, micro, meso, macro, and scale, local, regional, national, international. So, but underpinning all of these things are the interconnectedness of social, scientific, technological, policy, legal, and ethical aspects of innovation. And I argue that in healthcare, most innovations, at least in Canada, are social innovations, and that this framework helps us to shape how we think about research to inform practice. And I agree with Serenity that academically, we haven't kept pace with the need for evidence and for our ability to measure. So we need to be able to measure the impacts to increase our understanding of the effectiveness, what works best for whom and when. And we're beginning to understand these gaps. And George Cunha from Portugal wrote a really interesting literature review on the dimensions of social innovation. And these included social, environmental, economic, political, educational, and innovative processes. But the data sources, and that's why we're working so closely together, the data sources were mostly gray literature. And so we're now looking to the qualitative literature, trying to enhance the quantitative literature with more gray literature, because that worked. It was very informative for Cunha's work. But looking to the qualitative research for ideas, emerging ideas, that then we could turn into measurement, because we must be accountable to demonstrate those outcomes. And we need to consult with the practitioners at the front lines who need our support. We need to work together. And I'm also worrying about things like outcomes and impacts. And impacts are usually so much farther down the road. Can we actually attribute what we're doing with a social innovation to that impact? Or are there too many intervening factors? So our international team, including Serenity, is working to try and answer some of those questions. But right now, I still don't have good answers.
Well, Karen, I'll tell you, the thing I heard, and I don't want to say the only thing I heard, was that most things are social innovations, because I am also pitching that most things are social innovations, and should be, right? Stuart, I already saw you ready to go and ready to respond to that, because I know you have thoughts on measurement and how that looks. But before I just let you take it away, because I know you're already, I see you ready. I want to say, again, at the Praxis Oral Conference last summer, there was so much intentional focus around the logic models for how to get there, the theory of change for how to get there, that I really hadn't seen it presented so thoroughly and comprehensively to talk about measurement and impact. And so thoughts from you on this?
Sure, and I think the fun thing about this conversation is language is going to be key. So interesting, picking up from Karen's comments about when you start to think in this way, it's not just about the income generated, but the value. Now, my last thing, I talked about impact, and impact in the UK is that value, is the word that we use in quite a technical way to describe the value that that research is having in a myriad of ways. And the shift from income, which is easy to measure, to that value, that impact, is much harder to grasp, which I think Karen very eloquently sort of described. Now, in the UK, as we were on that journey from tech transfer to knowledge exchange, and as funders were thinking about what's the value, the return on the investment, to use sort of transactional language, we started to incorporate this thinking about impact. And actually, universities in the UK were measured on their impact. So we have an exercise called the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, where the government assesses the quality of university research. And a significant proportion of that is on the impact of that research and the quality of that impact. So on an individual research project basis, we're now being encouraged to follow that logic model from, at the beginning, what's your idea and what resources are you going to use to explore this bit of research, but how does that track through to it having an output, an outcome, and a benefit? So that's asked up front on research projects. But then in this research excellence framework exercise, we're asked as universities to take stock on what's actually happened and to measure the impact to be assessed by a peer panel. So that can be, from a piece of science research, what has been the impact in clinical practice, or it can be in social sciences or humanities research, what is the impact of that piece of research? And as Karen is outlining, that is a very difficult question to grapple with. But over a couple of cycles of this exercise in the UK, of this national exercise, we've been trying to grapple with how do you measure that on an individual project basis? And that takes time and that takes effort. But we have, if you Google search REF exercises in the UK, you'll see lots of data about how people are trying to articulate the outputs that lead to the outcomes that lead to the benefits from that piece of research. That's then expanded our sort of logic model. There are many ways many routes to have that impact. So tech transfer is one of those routes, that if you can identify and protect a piece of IP, you can license it or set up a spin out. But it could be through through a collaboration with a company, or with one of my colleagues always used to say, not always companies. It could be a non-governmental organization. It could be a charity, an external organization that could benefit from that research through collaboration, through understanding the know-how and building research. Or it could be through entrepreneurship, setting up new companies, not through tech transfer, or it could be through policy. So that social sciences research or scientific research is going to affect and impact the policy around a particular area. Or it could be through public engagement and changing public perception. So we have these different routes to impact. Again, it's technical terms in the UK that might sort of not seem like that, but impact being the outcome, and then these routes to impact being the way that you go down that logic chain from the activity you're doing through to that output and outcome. And then, as I say, all the way through thinking actually you're going to refine that route to impact if you're dealing with those beneficiaries from the start to the end. And that sort of chain caused a shift, a mindset shift in the UK, from it all being about income to it being about a variety of social impacts. And to pick up on your comment, Serenity, when you look at some of the spin-outs from universities, they are all mission-led companies, effectively. They're trying to solve malaria, or come up with a new vaccine for COVID, or come up with a new electric motor that will reduce carbon emissions. So inherently, they have a purpose and a mission behind them. But often, 10, 20 years ago, we were talking about the economic potential alone, rather than the economic potential and the social impact that can come with it. And the next sort of route to impact or mechanism to have an impact is through social enterprise. So actually not necessarily that traditional setup where I will take a large capital investment to generate a large profit, but I'm going to set up a company that's going to have a social benefit, a social impact. And actually in the UK in particular at Praxis, we've got a piece of work with our Economic and Social Research Council, thinking about how we can encourage better practice around generating those social ventures. So I'll put a link in the chat, but we're doing a lot of work in encouraging practitioners and academics to think about that mechanism and how that fits into this logic chain from research idea, activities, learning as normal through research, to what are the outputs and outcomes, and how do knowledge exchange, tech transfer, professional services help that impact to happen by building the relationships and understanding the mechanisms that can then mean that that can be most effective and ultimately lead to that impact being most impactful, rather than just job done, research finished. Does that go some other way to answer your question about logic models, Serenity?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a lean here though that makes me giggle a little bit, because when I first started in the office, the thing I promoted to everybody was, Ian has said I'm measured on return on impact, not return on investment, right? And in those first 6 months, like as he and I kind of, I was going to say battled, but that's not the right word, and I didn't want him to porcupine over it. As we, discussed, right, of what does this mean? Because we were on the same page about it, right? But it was this conversation around what does that mean? And how are we going to define impact? How are we going to say then, okay, the university's investment in this, in this unit has led to impact, right? And the investment in these researchers, these technologies has led to impact and ultimately income as well. But you're right. And I want to make sure nobody missed it. The key is on the value and how we're defining value. And so the ability for me to only have to focus on the value of what I was doing. Yes, it led to investment. Yes, it had led to income, but not because we sought that, right? But because we sought value. How are we putting value into the world? And Ian, I hope I just made your soapbox for this maybe a little bit bigger as opposed to stealing it. I'll save that for the next webinar where I take it, because I really do think this is actually the core, right, of the success and the mission that we're trying to drive here around social innovation. So, but why do you feel like social innovation is important? I've already set the stage that we know it's about impact. So why did that matter to you? Why does it matter to us on a national stage as well?
Sure. I saw Stuart raise his hand really quickly. And every time he does that, I know he has something very profound to say. So I want to make sure that he gets the point down.
So I was triggered by a sort of comment that Serenity said, just reminded me that I talked about the ref as measuring impact from specific research, but there's also measuring an institutional activity and how that activity is working. So again, in the UK, we have another sort of national initiative called the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Framework, which is a way that we try to measure knowledge exchange activities at an institutional level rather than a research-based level. So if you haven't heard of that, again, I'll put a link into the chat or share it to go around later. It's how we try and map activity and impact at an institutional level through these routes to impact that I talked about. And there's quite a sophisticated methodology for using data that we naturally collect and then mapping that so that you can see how universities are doing. So it is a challenging, knotty problem. You can look at it from an individual research project perspective, but you can also look at it an institutional perspective and try and capture some of those metrics about what that value is. Inevitably, that's hard. Some of it is, financial numbers in or income generated, but some of it gets down to sort of more broad metrics. And in that KEF, we have narratives, and the value of narratives alongside hard metrics is seen to be absolutely critical in explaining what's happening and telling the story. So I just wanted to insert that in before you asked the question to Ian about building on that, about why it's important.
I think that's actually a perfect bridge. Thanks for that, Stuart. So, impact, right? It is a constant job of anyone in knowledge exchange, technology transfer to be conveying the impact of their work. I was on the board of Autumn for 5 years. I was the chair of that board for a couple of years. And for as long as I've been a part of Autumn and in the field of technology transfer, we've been discussing metrics and how to measure impact of the work that we do. And I hit a point of enlightenment it was actually in a board meeting with Autumn, talking about metrics and the metrics that Autumn collects and that every tech transfer office puts out publicly. And of course, we all have internal messaging and narratives we try to paint, and the stories are really important, of course. But the point of enlightenment that I had around social innovation was that the end metric for most traditional, I'll call it sort of technology transfer work, STEM focused, right, is products sold. Because if you're trying to get sort of through the pipeline of discovery to intellectual property protection to license, ultimately the last thing that we can try to count is products sold. But products sold is never a good indicator of societal impact, right? Because it's a financial or economic metric, but it's not indicative of the actual societal impact that product is having. We always have this problem of trying to tie those ends. But in social innovation, as we have discovered through the entire pipeline that Serenity and her team have developed at the University of Kentucky, largely the end point of we'll call it the knowledge exchange or the technology transfer, is actually directly in touch with the person it's affecting, right? So we can much more easily, through social innovation, measure lives improved, lives impacted, people affected, than we can through something where the last thing that we can count is a product sold, right? It's a persons engaged through a training. It's it's a disruptive process for a community system, right? We can count people. And that's for me, that was a really powerful, we're on to something here moment. Because as and Serenity's team does very well with counting impact metrics, as we call them, that are focused on basically people-centric work. And it's really powerful if you think about it in that way, because very quickly we can start to actually see impact much more pointedly than we can through again, just a products sold perspective, right? Or products taken to market perspective. So I say that because that's important for my next point, which is on a much broader perspective of impact, and how do we measure the impact of this work? In fact, it often comes to me down to incentives, right? Because one initiative in the United States that was funded by an NSF, National Science Foundation study, was called PTI, Promotion and Tenure for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is, again, about diversifying the innovator base that engage with this type of work, but through the promotion and tenure process, by removing bias and being more inclusive in the activities that we count as scholarly work or research impact work, right? And that PTI effort has done a really good job in creating new awareness here in the United States on the power of counting more things. And as we started, I was a part of the coalition that helped to publish a first set of recommendations and even a paper published in Science on this work. What became really evident to us was what we're actually doing is being more inclusive for a larger crux of social innovators. Because to be honest, their work is already in the community. Like, their scholarly work is not just in a lab to a paper. It is already more directly touching community engaged activities. And that activity is, for the most parts, sort of ignored by most traditional promotion and tenure processes here. And so that is in and of itself another large, we'll call it needle mover activity that is also being federally funded here by the National Science Foundation and through even the TIP directorate here that has used that PTI initiative and referenced it through many of their own solicitations for new programs they're launching to encourage that activity, because frankly, it incentivizes our focus to put a microscope on the community engaged work sweeping it into, we care about this as scholarly activity and impact activity. And then by doing that, the tech transfer community should recognize it as focal to their work here in the United States, and mission critical as well.
There was a question that was posed very early on in the Q&A box about, and Ian, I'm going to stay here with you for just a second, about the difference between extension and social innovation. And I think actually for us in the US, this is where your answer was headed, because it's not the difference. And I'm actually going to get to my next topic area here. But would love your comments here. For me, I don't see it as different, right? It's more. It's a more
right.
solid infrastructure. It's an additional research lens. It's as Karen and Stuart have both said, it's an additional framework. But thoughts on, especially for our US cohort here, extension and social innovation.
Oh, that's a really important one. So to your point, Serenity, it's a yes and. It's additive. It is adding more things, not supplanting the things that we already count as scholarly work and impact work through research, but it is adding to the things that we recognize as being impactful, right, from that work. So it's a yes and. So extension, that's a fantastic one here. And so this gets Serenity to the recognition of a new set of partners, right? A new set of stakeholders to the work of knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, technology transfer, right? It's not just industry or customers or investors, although all of those are relevant here still. But now it's also community and the stakeholders that represent community growth, community organizations, we're a public land grant university here in the United States. We have an extension program that has outposts and people on the ground, connections, relationships in all, for example, in our case, over 100 counties, all of our 122 counties. And that reach, right, to do things like educate, create awareness, focused on the power of innovation, right? The power of progress, societal impact from that work. We're using that as a fantastic new stakeholder, frankly, to our work, not one that we had traditionally recognized as important to technology transfer. And Serenity and her team are making, just immense progress in actual community impact, right? From innovation happening on campus through a partner like our extension, our cooperative extension program, which other public land grant institutions across the United States have. So that's just an example, right, of the new reach, the additive characterization of this, and that's what makes it so important to focus on.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is also, where I want us to go next as a team, in that the ecosystem for social innovation is complex. It's sometimes a knotted web. I think the visual in our heads often when we talk about about ecosystem is this very pretty dot matrix thing that we can follow, and it is not. And in fact, because it is community embedded, because the stakeholders are so critical, the ecosystem piece of this can actually be a little bit tricky. Karen, I would love for you to talk more about the Social Innovation Initiative at Calgary, and how you all are using this to drive and grow your ecosystem, the measurement conference, because you opened with you are not the expert, but you follow the expertise of our friends over in the UK. And I often say the same thing about you, right? I am not the expert, but I am following Karen up at Calgary, as well as our friends over in the UK. So how are you still growing? How are you still building your ecosystem? And what are you all doing up at Calgary?
Well, I would say context, which was raised, is really critically important for research and innovation generally. So the city of Calgary and its university have this can-do mindset. And they'll say, that's a great idea, let's try that. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. So in this can-do ecosystem, we've had the freedom to try different initiatives to build capacity for social innovation. And we think of social innovation initiative at the university as the missing middle, linking government, society, business, and academics to address social challenges. And when I took this position as the director of social innovation, I talked to many community leaders. And a conversation with one executive director just stuck in my memory. She said, Karen, universities have created a thriving industry exploiting problems the community already knows it has. What we need are solutions. And what was happening was the university researchers were obtaining letters of support from the agency to check the community partner box on the grant, and there was limited or meaningful sustained engagement. So we reverse engineered community engagement. Now we work with the agency to turn their challenge into a researchable question and then solicit expertise from students and faculty to work with the agency. And I've got many examples, but I'll happily share those if people would like later. We also build capacity by coaching researchers through their decisions about how to mobilize their innovations. And we've tended to move toward that language of knowledge mobilization because that's an action. And we've moved a little bit from knowledge transfer to knowledge translation, now to knowledge mobilization. But we're trying to build this capacity because Stuart was telling us about all of the options. And most people are familiar with tech transfer offices, but they're not always a good fit for social innovators and social entrepreneurs. So we're pilot testing translating research to action, which is a 6-month coaching service to help researchers explore other options. And it's very well subscribed. Here for the first time ever in November 2023, Innovation Week, YYC, which is the call name for the Calgary Airport, we had a social innovation track. First time ever, and they're keeping it. We're developing 4 graduate courses in social innovation that'll form one of the certificates in our new master's degree in transdisciplinary studies. And there are many more examples of how we're trying to build that capacity and understanding of social innovation at the University of Calgary, but I'll stop there.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. I think there's so much in the ecosystem. And so Stuart and Ian, we have done so much together over the years around building this ecosystem, right, within tech transfer and social innovation. But I guess maybe I'm phrasing it to you all a little bit differently, more from a economic development perspective, right? Because you both have really talked about the importance and the ways that it impacts the community. So I'm going to add a layer to this already complex question and add a lens of if you can talk about ecosystem development for social innovation and why that's important also and for economic development as well.
Sure. What I'd have in, I think I might just follow on from Karen in terms of what we at Praxis are doing around this very practically before we go out to that lens. We're trying to build those communities of practice, those practitioners who can compare notes, who can share best practice, who can develop that. So I think Arnie's on the call, but Arnie is somebody working for Praxis who is trying to build communities of practice within the UK and internationally to compare notes. So I know Arnie would love to get in touch with you. And also in Praxis, we've got to the stage where we're now running courses to help people think about building social enterprises. So we're like Autumn, we run courses. We have tech transfer courses that we've run for years, but we now have an online social venturing course that runs in February and September every year. So that kind of, how do we support practitioners to explore and develop practice in this area? It is how we're trying to drive that forward at this cusp. You talked about innovation ecosystems, and to pick up on some of the thoughts, thank you, Ian, for slightly translating some of the American language around extension, which I think has a parallel in the UK. So you'll see, if you look at the KEF, the Knowledge Exchange Framework, regional innovation is a key part of it. And I think there's been a mind shift around the role of universities in the local ecosystem, particularly for the more well-established larger universities, that they are codependent on the regional ecosystem. That it's not just we do our thing and then the regional ecosystem carries on, but there's a codependence. And particularly in the large universities like Oxford and Cambridge, you can really see how they are clearly affecting the economic ecosystem through the spin outs that they're generating and the jobs that they're creating. But equally, when you dig a bit deeper, the size of those institutions as a large business, if you look at it through that lens, has a significant role to play on that local ecosystem. I think this starts to blur some of the ways of looking at universities, not just research. So as a procurer of services, what is the role of the university in that local ecosystem? How does it do that procurement to be socially, to think about the social value of what it does? So it starts getting very complicated. As an institution that has an estate and has a large population that works or studies in it, what can you do around that to support the local innovation ecosystem? So, and when you start thinking about knowledge exchange as affecting policy, as affecting collaboration with business, as helping people to start businesses, you see that there's this kind of meta role. And so a few years ago in Oxford, when I was working there, we got heavily involved in working with local government and trying to articulate better what the university was doing and how that might have an impact. And how the university can play a leading part or take a lead in certain areas. So if I use the example of social enterprise, Oxford had already got a big pipeline and a long track record in setting up spin-outs. STEM businesses usually requiring high capital investment. And we were seeing a pipeline of social enterprises with social impact building. And so we had the opportunity to think, well, how do we do this now, as opposed to how the ecosystem around the spin-outs built up through serendipity over time? And this was much more of a focused approach of, if we are going to start companies that have a social impact and we want them to be successful, we need to provide the environment where they will be successful. And how do we nurture that? So how do we encourage professional services that understand social enterprises? How do we encourage management teams that understand social enterprises? How do we help lawyers to understand how to engage more? So identifying lawyers and professional services that already got it, but working with them to try and articulate the needs and the opportunities around this space, and consciously building that ecosystem and that support. And that ultimately resulted in building a partnership of social enterprises existing, nothing to do with the university. Partly from the university's point of view of then, there is a more nurturing environment for our spin out on new companies to go into, because the ecosystem already understands them. And there are already existing, vibrant, valid businesses and organizations that do that. So I think when you get to that ecosystem building, away from just that we have some research, how do we transfer it out of the university to we have some research, and this is going to be strengthened by engaging with the communities, the publics, the organizations that are going to have a part to play in that. So then as an institution, how do you step back and think of the interdependence between the success of our research and teaching activities and the success of third stream or innovation are all dependent on how we engage with this regional ecosystem, how we support it and how it supports us. So increasing in the UK, the conversation is gravitating around that, of how do we consciously and intentionally help universities to play that role. And that conscious and intentional approach might require funding, might require better practice and comparing notes, learning from different examples. And that's the sort of frontier that I think we're now pushing at. And I know that in September, I'm having various conversations around with funding partners and organizations in government about how we can support that activity, articulate it and extend it. So I think the regional ecosystem piece is really important to help all of these things to sort of take off and really excel and reach their potential.
Hey, Ian, before you answer this, there is a question from the audience that I think Stuart and Karen are getting at. So I'm going to pose it real quick because then I to allow them to comment on it, but then you can answer the whole question, because I think it's really getting at what the direction Karen and Stuart are going, right? Like we could do a whole separate webinar on this around funding and supporting and how we engage, right? And so the question is, do you see similarities between social innovation for universities and the movement toward engaged philanthropy? And there's two steps here, right, that are posed. One, philanthropists identify a solution to a problem and funds for the first use case, while in parallel then also working with the relevant communities and stakeholders in government, media, academia, philanthropy to provide feedback, to identify support for expanding beyond that one use case to scale, right? Which then include 501c3 nonprofits, 501c4s, lobbyists, all the pieces, right? But so I think you both have already leaned towards yes, but any comments you want to touch on related to that?
Yeah. So just quickly, really, this is really important. So if we think of philanthropy, so in the university context, oftentimes when we say the word philanthropy, we immediately go to sort of wealthy alumni to put their name on buildings, right?
Mm-hmm.
But change that term to just philanthropic effort. The same way you could change entrepreneurship to entrepreneurial activity. Philanthropic effort are those that are advocates for supporting and donating time to a mission, right? To a cause. And I think if you put that in perspective around social innovation, it can get pretty powerful, because part of the work in social innovation and really just ecosystem building around it is advocacy. And part of it is advocating for, again, people or human-centric or community engaged work. And that could necessarily involve philanthropy as a source of funding, as well as just in-kind help and support from community organizations and others that want to donate their time to that societal improvement effort. So I think that's a really important thing. And then you can do that through, the vehicles that we often think of for that kind of work, like nonprofits, right? So you can develop a nonprofit, that's a social venture, right? And so I think that's a really important one to tie together, and is important. The last thing I just want to say really quickly to the last question posed to Stuart and I, just around ecosystem building. We noticed that this was going to be over important to our success here when we started to engage with the community. Tech transfer, knowledge exchange. It's not just an office on a campus that has an end product that you send off the campus and then you go. If you're going to do it right, you have to truly effort to build the ecosystem. So we launched here at UK Innovate just a couple months ago a new ecosystem pillar, which really combines two main things: our programs and resources that we're doing coaching, mentorship, and training. And if you think about how do you build an ecosystem, you have to educate, mentor, coach, train people to understand these things, to work together around these things. And so that's where, and that new ecosystem pillar, as Serenity knows, is building a cohort focused on training, mentorship, coaching of social innovations, where we're sort of putting those two concepts together. So that the ecosystem building aspect is critical, and it's, again, just like measurement, brings directly into focus the need to do it in a people-centric way.
Perfect. Well, we are right at 1 o'clock. I, really kind of wanted us to leave on a little bit of a cliffhanger, if you will, because I do hope everybody will join us in November. We'll talk more tactics around knowledge exchange and funding for social innovations. And then February, that webinar will be on metrics, and more to come about who will be joining us in those spaces. So at that point, Rohan, I think I turn it back to you
Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you found today's webinar insightful, and a special thank you to our incredible panelists as well for sharing their expertise with us. Today's webinar is a part of an ongoing series, so we have 2 more social innovation webinars planned for later this year and early next year. We'll be sending out more information about those events happening soon. And there also will be a recording of today's session available on the UK Innovate YouTube channel. So we'll send up a follow-up email with the link to that recording. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you again, everyone, for your time and participation, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.